What would you do if you could tell when someone you know was going to die? I hope I got your attention with that one, but really though, what would you do? Would you try to save them? You would, right? Like, I really hope you. But what if it was someone you didn't know? Would your answer change? What if it was the 5th, 6th, 10th, 100th person you had to save? Would you still have that same spirit, or would you let your morality slip away in favor of self-preservation? Before you answer, really think on it. Because if you think on it for long enough, you might be surprised at the answer you come to. Now, you might be wondering why I asked you a question that philosophers and actually smart people have been trying to answer for centuries and expected you, a normal person, to answer it. Well, that's because the story we are talking about today asks this exact question. And the name of that story is The Dune.
Wait a minute!
No, not that Dune. This Dune. There's a difference because this one has the before it. Part 1. The story. A person only known as the judge slowly gets on a kayak in broad daylight. He's going to a small island, described in the text as something that's barely seen out in the sea. Just a yellow bump in the vast blue ocean. We don't know why he's going there, but with only the first paragraph, we can already tell that he's obsessed with the place. And he's willing to risk his body for that obsession. Because Judge is old. I mean, really old. I mean, he was friends with Aristotle old. That's how old he is. He's a 90-year-old whose body hurts with every movement. And he reflects on his younger days as he gets on the kayak. Back then, there would be no aches. But now, every time he moves, his guts burn with pain. He feels excitement when he goes to this island, but he also feels dread, like closing in on a rabid dog. It's hard to describe if you have never really experienced it, but excitement and dread go hand in hand. And you don't have to be a freak to feel that way. That's why people can't look away from tragedies, even though they might not like the tragic event. In fact, let me demonstrate that right now. Look at this. I believe this was test footage and nobody actually got hurt, but you didn't know that. You were tense, weren't you, waiting for that moment of the clash? And when it happened, you felt some feeling of pleasure. My guess is that's exactly the same feeling that Judge has. But what exactly on the island makes Judge feel so uneasy? There are many islands like this around the world, just submarine-sized, containing nothing. They usually get blown away or drowned when a disaster comes. Most normal ones do anyway, but this is a Stephen King story. Throughout Judge's long life, he had seen many hurricanes and natural disasters, and after each one, he was sure that the pin-sized island would go. But it never sunk. There was even a hurricane in 1944 that sank a USS Warrington, and if you don't know what that is, that's a whole giant battleship straight out of the pages of a sci-fi novel. It sunk that, but it couldn't sink this island. In fact, it couldn't even blow away the sands on the dune of this island. There is magic in this place. Twisted and malicious as we'll find out throughout the story, but magic nonetheless.
Over the years, he has debated back and forth about whether the magic is in him or in the island. Perhaps it's both, but surely most of it is in the dune.
He's been going to this island for 80 years now, thousands and thousands of times over the years. It's only now, after all that, do we finally learn our main character's name, Harvey Beecher, which is a tribute to W.F. Harvey. He came from a family of wealth that would make Bruce Wayne look like a pleb, but he abandoned the trust fund kid life to become a lawyer, who eventually got promoted to a judge and then comfortably retired as one of America's most famous judges. This is why he earned the highly creative nickname, The Judge, which I will be calling him for the rest of the story. Now, the part I'm about to discuss comes nearly at the end of the story, but I think it's just better if I tell this to you right now. It's revealed that there were only a handful of years that he ever left Pelican Point, his childhood home, and it was when he lawyered at Tallahassee. But he admits that these were the worst years of his life, not because he hated the place or the people there, but because he couldn't go to the dune. My point being, he's literally a junkie experiencing withdrawal symptoms. Or a better example would be like Gen Z going a day without phones. Anyway, Judge now lives a comfortable life in Pelican Point as a Sigma male, which translates to extremely lonely and socially deprived. Which is why even though he's clearly having issues with his body, he's still able to go to the island unaccompanied. There are his housekeeper and caretaker, but they both know to avoid him. and he likes it that way. He lies to them by saying that he's writing a memoir when he goes out on these excursions, even though he has not written a word of the memoir in 2 years. Judge knows that he'll die before he ever finishes that memoir, but he doesn't regret it, because there's a far more interesting story that he won't be able to tell the world. The one story he would only tell to a dead man. The dopamine receptors in my brain are just going crazy right now, because on a rewatch, that sentence is going to go hard. He reaches the island and sees buzzards circling him. This is when we see a little deeper into Judge's character, or more specifically, his belief in omens. He thinks of a time when he heard a man say that buzzards are an omen of death, and every time they circle a place, tragedy soon follows. When I researched that fact for this video, and when I say research, I mean a single Google search, I found that buzzards are apparently supposed to symbolize the end of one era and the beginning of another. The buzzard is also associated with death and rebirth. It is said that when a buzzard screams, it signals the end of one era and the beginning of another. Should have added buzzards into that keeping quiet video, huh?
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
He sees the path he has beaten across the island, a path that he had walked over and over again for the past century, and walks it one more time, and then he spots the dune.
He tells himself that the dune will be just a smooth, blank upslope of sand, as it is most days. But he knows better.
The dune is normal on most days, just a regular mound of sand, but very rarely something special occurs, usually accompanied by an omen of death. Oh, look at those buzzards there! Judge knew that today it was not going to be a normal dune. And then the unease sets in. King does a perfect job of showing his excitement and terror all mushed into one as he walks closer to the dune. His heartbeat rises and he gets a hit of dopamine, like when you're about to eat something sweet. And then he goes closer and he sees... While you're waiting for that reveal, you might want to smash that subscribe. You don't actually get to know what Judge sees, and if you're waiting for the answer to be revealed, then I'm sorry to disappoint you. It's never revealed. But throughout the story, you'll start to form a vague idea of what he saw, along with what kind of person Judge really is. But for now, just put a pin on it. It'll be important later. We flash forward to the next day and cut to the perspective of Anthony Wayland, a relatively young lawyer who arrives at Pelican Point because his client, Harvey Beecher, called him to his estate. Judge apparently wanted to make some sudden changes to his last will and immediately requested Anthony Wayland to come to his estate and draft it for him. One of the things I really like about stories like this is whenever there's a huge reveal, and spoilers alert, there's going to be a huge reveal, it's hinted on throughout the story in minor innocent lines, kind of like this one.
You know, I'm kind of surprised you didn't draft this document yourself. You've probably forgotten more Florida probate law than I've ever learned.
If that seemed like a normal line to you, this is Stephen King. He's weird. Jokes aside, keep this line in mind though, it's gonna be pretty important at the end. This is a valid question though. Why did one of the greatest lawyers in this part of the country choose a young and inexperienced lawyer to write his last will? It's clear that Judge has no issues with his memory. In fact, I think he might have a tad too much memory, you'll see later. Judge just answers that question by saying,
You know that old saying about how a man who serves as his own lawyer has a fool for a client?
which is pretty valid. Have you ever seen those guys who represent themselves in court?
By the time it's all said and done, you will see who is the mass murderers.
So Judge starts saying all the changes he wants to make, and Anthony whips out the notebook and starts writing. Judge makes a lot of additions to his last will, and that too so suddenly, and he seems extremely reckless, spending $4 million on wildlife and conservation not because he cares for animals or trees, but because he wants to spite the director of wildlife and conservation. Like, I respect being a hater, but spending $4 million just to hate is just insane. But the main addition he wanted, the one thing he wasn't careless with, was making sure that the island with the dune is declared wild forever. And because nobody knew the secret of the dune, that wasn't exactly hard to do. Anthony says that he will need 2 witnesses to make it official, but his housekeeper and caretaker conveniently took their holidays just the day before. So Judge is like,
Nah, it'll be fine.
and says that when they get back, he'll get it signed. Before Anthony could even speak another word, Judge took the draft and stuffed it in his vault. Now, the thing I want you to notice is not what he does, but how he does it. Watch.
The judge enters the correct combination, making no attempt to hide the touchpad from view, and deposits the will on top of what looks to Wayland like a large and untidy heap of cash.
Is this the same dude from yesterday? A man who would literally risk death to keep them hidden. What changed? Those are all fine questions, but the real question is, what did he see on the dune to make him change? Judge asks Anthony to sit down and have some drinks with him, and Anthony accepts because
Billable hours are, after all, billable hours.
do nothing and make money, that's as close to heaven as we are getting on earth. Judge then sits down and drinks some decaf coffee and starts telling his story. The story of his entire family and the story of the dune. Everything after this takes place in this one room. Never changing place, but it's also tense and horrifying, the point of a horror novel. Judge starts his story off with his grandfather, how he supposedly fought in the Spanish-American War. He pulled out a picture of his grandfather standing on a hill as proof. The Beecher family values honor and laws more than anything. Psych! Yeah, Judge does not care. He blatantly admits that his grandfather was a con man and was a very successful one at that. Even though he and his father were judges, it was his grandfather that made the Beecher family wealthy. It was his grandfather that unknowingly introduced Judge to the island, a land that I'm guessing he purchased and he couldn't flip because there's only so much you can do with a dry strip of land. So one day his grandfather wanted to entertain? Yeah, we'll go with entertain a maid. He told that the legendary pirate Blackbeard had come to this island and buried his treasure there. Judge, being an idiot kid, took his word for it and rushed to the island. But of course, he didn't find any treasure there, not in the conventional sense at least. What he found though was a name scribbled on the sand. It read Robbie LaDouche. See, Robbie was one of young Harvey's closest friends. In the text, it says that they were joined at the hip. So it could be that Harvey wrote his name and misremembered. It has been 80 years after all. Or someone who knew Robbie wrote his name as an elaborate prank. The 20th century version of It's Just a Prank, bruh. I mean, it was the 1930s and there was nothing much exciting to do, so writing people's name on the sand must have been as exciting as a hit of coke. Just two problems with this theory though. Robbie had gone to vacation just a few days back and wouldn't be back for weeks. And two, his name is not actually Robbie LaDouche. That was something that Harvey made up because he couldn't pronounce Robert LaDoucette. In fact, only Harvey and Robbie's closest friends even knew the name. And none of them knew that the island even existed. Now, I should give you time to process what I just said, but I want you to direct your attention to this line.
So some of the magic comes from me. It must come from me. The question is, how much?
Suspicious, huh? Obviously, this is a book and I can't see the facial expressions that the characters make, but I would like to think that Anthony was looking at him something like that, yeah. After a little bit, Judge simply says,
My chum Robbie never came back from that vacation. We got word a week or so later that he'd taken a fall while out horseback riding. He broke his neck, killed instantly. His parents were heartbroken. So was I.
Anthony thinks that this is all an elaborate joke made up in the head of someone whose life insurance is going to activate soon. Think about it, what use is money when you're dead? That could be one of the reasons why he was so careless with it anyway. Not like he can face any repercussions if he's dead. In the business, this is what we call foreshadowing. Judge asks Anthony to sit down and let him continue his story, which he does because he likes the drink and also likes getting paid. Judge went to that dune again and again for years without finding a thing. No name, just sand. He almost began to forget that he even found Robbie's name. Maybe it was all in the head. But then one day, he found yet another name, Peter Alderson. Judge looked at it confused. This name didn't mean anything to him. It wasn't his best friend's name. It was just a name. So he went about his life. Until a few days later, when in the newspaper he read,
Window washer killed in Freak Fall.
the name of that window washer? Peter Alderson. Anthony now looks at Judge like he's a clown. That is to say that Judge's judgment is not present at the time. Man, I'm a genius. You come to this channel for high quality lines like that, don't you? Despite being his lawyer, Anthony could still tattle to the authorities about Judge's delusions. Maybe in the hopes of saving him from a complete mental break. Because Anthony seems to genuinely care about Judge. But Judge, again, does not care.
We do not care.
And really, the young man's belief or disbelief is beside the point. It's just such a luxury to tell it.
This was something he had kept locked up inside for decades, and it must have felt really good to finally share it with another human being. By this point, it should be pretty clear that Judge's views on death is a little bit strange. Or more specifically, you could say that he's detached from death. In fact, throughout the whole story, he seems to be detached from everything. Everything seems to be so boring to the judge. Everything except the dune. He looks at the names on the dune not only with horror, but also a mixture of wonder and excitement. And the funny thing is, Judge basically admits that he has made a weird and twisted bond with the island.
I respect the place. I fear the place. And most of all, I'm addicted to the place.
Judge says that after seeing Peter Alderson's name, he has visited the island every day since, seeing a plethora of names that just die a few days or weeks later, but they never last more than a month. The people he knew would have nicknames, and the people he didn't know would just be regular names. Judge read all of these names like how you or I would read the newspaper, never really giving it much thought. I mean, they're just random people after all. Why should he care? Because we only care about tragedy, really care about tragedy when it affects us. And that's exactly what happened in 1940. When he paddled out, but instead of seeing just another name, he saw Grampy Beecher, his grandfather. 3 days later, he died of a heart attack in Key West. Anthony is now actually invested in the story, because despite how crazy it sounds, it's pretty interesting. So he asked Judge if he did anything to save his grandfather. I mean, this wasn't just a random person, this was someone he loved and cared for. Judge's response with,
I didn't know it was a heart attack until we got word from the Monroe County Medical Examiner, did I? It could have been an accident or even a murder.
When Anthony was about to say something to counter, Judge quickly adds,
Also, I was afraid. I still feel, as if there on that island, there's a hatch that's come ajar. On this side is what we're pleased to call the real world. On the other is all the machinery of the universe, running at top speed. Only a fool would stick his hand into such machinery in an attempt to stop it.
Judge has clearly given this dune a lot of thought. I mean, his life basically revolved around the dune after all, so I guess that should be expected. He even has a pretty well thought out theory on the origin of the dune and how it operates. Anthony gets ready to leave. He has had his fill of crazy for the day, and maybe some brain rot will help. But Judge stops him. He wants to tell one more story. And like the character in a horror movie he is, Anthony sits down to listen. In 1959, Judge came home a little late from work. It was a pretty rainy day. He got his canoe and paddled to the island with the dune. Now it's around dusk, and for the people who have seen the ocean at dusk, you know it's just beautiful, man. He reaches the island with the water glowing in orange hue. Judge expected there to be no names on the dune like most days, but then he saw it. Usually this is the part where I would describe what happens or what he saw, but I can't do this scene justice. So I'm just going to let Stephen King cook.
There wasn't just one name written in the sand that evening, but many. And in that red sunset light, they looked as if they had been written in blood. They were crammed together. They wove in and out. They were written over and above and up and down. The whole length and breadth of the dune was covered with a tapestry of names. The ones down by the water had been half erased.
Judge was paralyzed with fear and dread. There was no excitement this time. It was real now. He screamed and scurried back to shore. Judge says that this incident scared him so much that he didn't even come back to the island for months. But eventually he came crawling back like it was an abusive relationship and never left after that. The names were of a plane crash that occurred just 2 days after seeing the names on the dune. Judge stops for a second, letting Anthony process that information, and then asks Anthony if he understood why Judge had called him on this particular day. Even though Anthony didn't believe in any of what Judge had said, he thought that Judge's stories had its own twisted logic. And if after all these years of reading other people's names on the sand, if Judge finally saw his own. But Judge responds,
Oh no, he says, not mine.
Part 2. Judge. That ending goes crazy, doesn't it? Let's finally analyze the true villain of the story, Harvey Judge Beecher. Y'all remember the opening of the video when I asked you what you would do if you had the foresight of another person's death? How many of you said you would do nothing? There's something so malicious and vile about doing nothing when you clearly have the opportunity to do something at almost no cost to you. This is why, even if all the Batman fanboys rail me in the comments, I'll stick to my opinion that this scene
I won't kill you, but I don't have to save you.
is trash. Throughout the story, we all assume that Judge saw his own name on the Dune. At least I did when I first read the story. But he saw Anthony's name instead. This was why he was so reckless with his secrets. Why he even shared his story of the Dune in the first place. It was because Anthony was a dead man, and dead men tell no tales. Judge throughout his life has been a passive observer of death, never really stepping in to help or even warn the people he saw the names of. But in his old age, he finally wants to take an active role and see how the Dune operates. And Anthony Wayland, a person he calls son by the way, is his test subject. It is kind of ironic that a person who loves death so much like Judge has lived a long and healthy life. Because of his long-term exposure to death, his perspective on it has become so fatally screwed that to him it's more important to learn the secrets of the Dune than to save a life. Even though he's a terrible person and clearly the villain of the story, I don't think he was like this when he was a child. He must have been a relatively normal kid who just happens to be exposed to death so often that it got normalized. It's kind of like when you first do pull-ups and your skin chaps and it really hurts, but after a while it calluses and you barely feel anything anymore. In the original question I posed in this video, Judge was a person who let his morality slip away in favor of self-preservation. You could argue that Judge is smart because he never interrupted the process and just watched it. If the Dune is an agent of fate, why try to stop fate? Didn't you see what happened to those guys in Final Destination? But the thing that intrigued me and really made me want to make this video is how accurate he is as a judge. Let me explain. Even though he invited Anthony to his house, presumably to watch his death, he never actually takes part in Anthony's death. He's not even responsible for it. So in the court of law, if anyone tried to sue Judge, he would have the perfect alibi. He didn't do anything. Y'all know what this reminds me of?
I won't kill you, but I don't have to save you.
A guy named Judge never judges, just watches. He's the opposite of justice. Because justice is blind, but Judge sees all. That's all I have to say. If you like this video, then you might like the analysis I did on keeping quiet. It should be somewhere here. I was a bit pretentious back then, but I was just a beginner. So with all that said, thank you for watching. I genuinely mean that. Goodbye.